into one of the 4 categories there. So, what are we actually here for? We have a cost of living crisis, and we are seeing elevated risks from climate change. What does this have to do with us? Basically, housing is a huge line item for most families. We're not building enough of it. You all probably know a lot of this about the shortage. We're not going to solve it one 20-unit building at a time. We need places to build at scale, and really the best place to give people access to economic opportunities, the existing resources we've built up in our communities across California, is to do it inside our existing communities. And as you all know, some of the biggest vacant and underutilized pieces of land, they're all brownfields. So without cleanup, the other danger we all kind of face from these brownfields is that many of them are at risk of sea level rise. And as those sea levels rise, groundwater will also mobilize these contaminants into some of the most vulnerable communities across California. So I think we have both an urgency and one of the biggest opportunities here in terms of how do we build the housing we need, how do we get to neighborhoods that have been left behind, create new beneficial reuses by accelerating brownfield cleanup and redevelopment. So it's good things. There's great stuff. New housing, better health outcomes, local government revenue. These are all things y'all engage in all the time. I don't need to tell you that. But what we're here for today is to figure out what can we think about as a 10-year vision for reforms. What could we actually change that would make a difference here? And we really would love you guys, as you're listening to the experts share these challenges, think about what could you see in the long term? Not necessarily next year. We don't want to limit kind of the vision here. So really appreciate you guys staying on that. The other small caveat I will have before turning it over to the experts in the room is we want to stay away from funding specific solutions or reforms. We're looking more regulatory or other outside the box. Funding is critical. We all know that. But I think today we want to focus on other changes we can make to leverage existing funding and bring in new funding from the private sector as well. So these are the common challenges that the lovely experts are going to present on. You'll see them across the back, again, on those bigger pieces of paper. And without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to some folks to talk about common challenges and really appreciate your time being here. Serena.
Thanks, Robin. For those who don't know, I'm Serena Collins. I'm a development manager for New Way Homes. And I'm gonna quickly highlight how after 7 years, I've been working to escape limbo and ultimately develop a 75-unit, 100% affordable housing project that will also have a kitchen incubator and a women's small business center down in Salinas, California. The site was formerly an auto repair shop, an agricultural site, but currently contains primarily underutilized storage units and an ice cream wholesale company. But to get housing on the site, we have to remediate it. Sounds simple enough, right? Well, let's take a look down memory lane. So, as I mentioned, we started with this site 7 years ago, back in 2018. New Way Homes was introduced to the site. We jumped right in, conducted a phase 1, and started our phase 2 assessment. Both were self-funded. In 2020, our cleanup plan was approved, but in the background, this little pesky thing called the pandemic was brewing. And while we continued to pay for quarterly monitoring, we actively sought out grant funding to clean up the site. Fortunately, the DTSC ECRG program came around right in the nick of time, and we were fortunate to get a round one grant in 2022. But as I mentioned, this little pesky thing called the pandemic that was brewing since 2020, well, it kind of came in and blew up our pro forma as construction costs continued to climb. New Way Homes typically privately finances our projects, but due to construction escalation, we had to switch over to public subsidy. Now, that generally wouldn't have been a challenge, except for we instantly hit a roadblock. And for those of you who are familiar with public subsidy and have dealt with affordable housing for a long time, you know you have to go through a NEPA process. What I didn't realize was that I couldn't do anything related to environmental work and getting in the ground due to that NEPA process, or I wouldn't be eligible for funding. So delay, delay, delay. After going back and forth with HUD and the local jurisdiction for a bit, we were actually able to get a disaggregation of projects, just meaning that the brownfield cleanup and the housing project were considered two separate projects on the same site. Yay, we can move forward, except for when a moratorium hit, so 6 months delay. Worked with the local jurisdiction to get our permits, but then that was delayed. So in fall of 2023, almost a year after initially getting the award from DTSC, we're actually able to start our cleanup. Got in the ground, realized there was more contamination than expected, chased it as far as we could, hit another winter moratorium, ran out of funding, waited a year, got some more funding from DTSC. We had some staffing turnover from our regulatory oversight agency, which then resulted in more quarterly monitoring being required. And so now we're easing into our last round of hopefully required monitoring before we can actually get back in the ground after the winter moratoriums this year. And here we are, almost 7 years later. And during these past 7 years, we've been delayed due to funding gaps, NEPA delays, regulatory oversight changes, winter moratoriums, permitting, so on, and so forth. But the truth is, our story isn't unusual. You'll hear these kind of delays are happening all across California with a myriad of sites. But if we want brownfield redevelopment to really be magic and not tragic, we need more reforms that give projects a fair shot at success. And I'm looking forward to discussing how we can do that together. At this time, I'll transfer it over to my co-panelist, Rafat.
Thank you, Serena. Welcome. My name is Rafat Abbasi. I'm a consultant at Geosyntec right now, senior consultant. Prior to being at Geosyntec, I was a branch chief at CALRC DTSC, the site mitigation brownfield program. So was there for a generation and a half. So I'm going to emphasize and talk a little bit about community engagement, early community engagement. I think when I started out with DTSC, I think back in the day, 1993-94 timeframe, I would think community engagement was part of the CERCLA 9 criteria process, community assessment, community involvement, and that was about it. We never ever got community engaged before we were actually developing cleanup plans. But I think as we evolved into the process in the brownfield redevelopment, we realized that community engagement is extremely important. So 25 years later, 30 years later, we continue to evolve, and this project is a consummation of how I believe, in my point of view, community engagement should be done. So I'm gonna emphasize that, and I'm gonna bring out some of the issues we dealt with and hopefully provide some guidance to all of us how we should do community engagement and the time frame associated with it. So I'm going to talk briefly about a site located in Harupa Valley. It's about 292-acre site that was basically a cement plant. It started operation in 1906 and probably got defunct around 2014 timeframe. It was a very, very poor community, and the California DTSC uses CalRC screen scores to determine how destitute the community is, how distressed the community is. This site actually had the highest score on CalRC screens. So just want to let you know it was a very poor community, and the developer came in and talked to us about it when I was a regulator, and they want to redevelop that site into a warehouse. And for those of you who've been here long enough, realize that how difficult the warehouse projects are in California these days because of a variety of reasons. So it was critically important to understand how we should do community engagement, and those are some of the things that we thought about. Now, this is not, initially I was talking to you about community involvement is at the remedial action plan phase or when we are actually developing cleanup plan, but this was very unique. This is pretty innovative in my view, so I'm going to shed some light on it. The few things that I think a lot of us who are involved in community engagement already know, but I think one of the things that we learned and we implemented is early engagement. Early engagement in this sense means that you are communicating with the community advocates right at the transactional point. When you are actually making the transaction on the property, we need to really identify the community groups and make sure that community groups are engaged. Emphasize project public health protection. This was a cement plant, I mentioned that to you. It has very high contamination of arsenic, lead, and chromium-6. So making sure that you identify public health protection aspect of the project, and also emphasize that how the project will actually minimize exposure, reduce exposure, and protect public health in the environment. The third element here is communicate economic opportunities. The project, not only do we need to communicate public health protection, which is very important and front and center, we also want to talk about economic vitality for the community. Those are some of the things that we emphasized early on in the project while the transaction was going on. And then, of course, focus on long-term protection, such as engineering control and how remedial action plan would implement long-term measures so that the project will continue to be protective of public health and environment. So those are some of the things we focus on. And this is few photos that it looked like. The cement plant looked like. You can see the silos and things like that. I'm not going to go. I'm told I'm running out of time here. And few overcoming the roadblocks, community engagement I just talked about, early community engagement, emphasizing public health protection, both short-term and long-term, and also economic opportunities for the people in the community. And then, of course, regulatory barriers. I think Gina is going to talk a little bit about it, how she overcome that. Well, thank you for that.
Hi, everybody. Let's see. Oh, look at that. Ravad had extra slides. Imagine that. So I'm Gina Plants with Haley & Aldrich. I'm happy to be here today. Surprise, surprise, I'm going to talk a little bit about vapor intrusion. It was funny, when I left my house, my husband said, "What are you talking about this week, vapor intrusion?" And I said, "Yes." He goes, "Attenuation factors again?" I said, "No, I'm not." So I am promising you, and I promised Ben, that I would not be talking about attenuation factors. So I want us, when we separate out and get into groups, my table, we're going to talk a lot about how can we improve upon these decisions that we're making for future buildings, what long-term OM&M looks like when we put in vapor intrusion mitigation systems. That's really what I want the focus point to be. I love this title, Better Than 1 in a Million. I mean, everybody loves 1 in a million. It always sounds great, right? But achieving that, either when it comes to cleanup, takes a lot of costs. and it takes a lot of time. So is that what we need to be doing? So there's a few things here that I want us to focus on, and the takeaways here, I've said this plenty of times over the years, but screening levels, when we look at screening levels, we need to remember they were developed not to be cleanup goals, right? So screening levels are supposed to be there to tell us if we should go collect more information, not that this is what you need to achieve for a property to be safe. And sometimes we forget that, and I think part of that reasoning is because screening levels are so easy to find, right? They're printed, they're published by EPA, Regional Water Quality Control Board, DTSC, so there's lots of things we can point to that say these are screening levels. But cleanup goals take a little more intention and thoughtfulness to get to, and sometimes it's really difficult to get down that road when you start looking at screening levels at that point. And the good thing about screening levels, it gives us that black and white of if you're below a screening level, nothing to see here, move on, go do something else. When it comes to vapor intrusion, I think we all know, pretty rare, it's 1 in a million that we're below screening levels, right? So it's just something that we need to be thinking about as we're looking at these sites. And to make it even more complicated, right? So we're talking about specifically here vapor intrusion. So derivations matter for our soil vapor screening levels and cleanup goals, right? So accounting for the attenuation into the building, and for the sites where we're looking at and working on, we don't have buildings. So we need to be understanding and evaluating that really complex transport mechanism into future buildings. So how we interpret that really helps us get back to what our screening level is. So getting to a cleanup goal is even sometimes more, in some people's minds, more difficult to get to. But what if we had some sort of, risk management framework to look to? Again, a conversation I had before this talk was, it's a risk management decision to get to if you're gonna, move on when you're in that, greater than 1 in a million risk. Well, so can we get to a framework that we agree to for that risk management to help us out? Guess what? We have that. So there is, there's the risk management framework that was developed for NCP, and it's used in California as well. And again, there's some quotes up here from the Water Board and the Army Corps of Engineers and EPA as well. You can't read that fine print. But basically, exposures to environmental chemicals resulting in risks within the 10 to the minus 6 to the 10 to the minus 4 risk range are generally considered to be protective and acceptable. So sometimes I think we're forgetting about that. And we're thinking if we're above that 1 times 10 to the minus 6, we have to go do something, do some cleanup. No, we have to go assess. We need to understand. So this nice figure here is from a DTSC document for vapor intrusion back in 2011. So we were looking at that point in time, back in the day of when I think we had more science-based policy than opinion-based policy, where we had, a risk management range to look to and turn to. So I'm hoping our conversations can get us all back to thinking this way. And this slide, there's a lot on here. I'll tell you all about the blogs later, and you can learn more about this slide. But all the way to the right-hand side, the VIMs with OM&M and indoor air required. The OM&M plans, the sampling plans, how long do you do it, indoor air sampling, these are things that I'm gonna wanna dive into at my table, because we forget that even if we want a lot of data, somebody has to pay for it in the end, right? So the cost for 30-year OM&M is gonna go on to our future homeowners, and so we have to keep that in mind. What makes sense based upon our data to ensure that our VIMs are operating as designed? Thank you. Next. Middle table.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jeff Adams with NGO Incorporated. I'm very happy to be here today because anytime you bring together brownfields professionals, it's one of those rare examples where we come together, we're all trying to accomplish the same thing, regardless of what one's role is. It's refreshing to be in a position where the strategy and the mission are essentially shared among everybody that touches the project. The devil is in the details, though, with respect to execution. And that's what I'm going to talk about today, a project. And this is not meant to highlight a failure. It's a successful project by many metrics, but it really is more frustration associated with process. And in speaking with a number of people, In trying to determine what to talk about today, the first question was, well, which project do you want to bring up? There are many. And that's not only with my colleagues, but I could have called other consultants, I could have called attorneys, city or county officials, could have called regulators, attorneys, etc. And everybody has stories like this of when did the process go off the rails for something that should have been simple. And this became a fairly easy project for us to discuss because, again, it's straightforward, it's simple, but it does leave, when you look at the numbers, of why did it have to be that way? So talking about the project, it was rehabilitation of a 50s era flood control channel. When I was a kid, we used to call a ditch. It was a flood control ditch. Linear structure that went out to the bay that controlled stormwater for areas adjacent or near the structure. And the idea was to come back in, rehabilitate it more with a green infrastructure approach, put in a meander, put in some other amenities, a footpath, some native vegetation, et cetera, to create a nice space. The property was adjacent to an existing community college, so the idea was to encroach on their property a little bit to get access to the facility to expand. So a narrow channel became a little bit of a wider berth to allow for that meander. Previous to the work that had been done, going back to the middle part of a couple decades ago, the site had been an agricultural facility, had been a farmer's field with agricultural impact before the community college had been built. And the idea was a very straightforward one. It was take the impacts off of surface soils from the area that would be developed, flop it over on another portion and clean cap it. Very straightforward. It had been done with DTSC oversight, but again, this is almost independent of the agency. Many agencies that we all work with every day would have a similar approach. There had been an approved RAW, everything was done. There were no surprises associated with this, and everything had been completed by the mid-2000s. We got a call from the client in January 2020, which of course is key to one of the things that we're talking about today. Client calls us, gives us a heads up that the work is coming our way, and then of course March 2020, everything changes. Go home, COVID is on. Importantly too, the DTSC, much of their staff was devoted to COVID response, if we all remember. So, consultants were trying to figure out what to do, and certainly various regulatory officials were doing bigger and better things at the time. Ultimately, we got back on track. December of 2020, we got permission, went out and did some additional characterization, found that nothing had changed. The site had been well characterized when it was constructed and remediated as detailed. We submitted an ESD report, an explanation of significant differences in 2021, went to staff, and then there was some turnover. And again, this happens, we understand it, but it did cause some notable delays. Over the course of 2022, we were in contact with DTSC. How are things coming along? Our client was getting a little bit nervous. Everything looks good, everything's fine, yeah, we're just going through and taking care of it. And then we got a notification in the fall of 2022 when some other people became involved with the project that there were some deficiencies. And I put in exclamation points because that was a surprise. It was a fairly straightforward project. We were surprised to hear this. Like everybody in this room, we got a document that came back, some comments, address these comments and submit revised documents. Nothing out of the ordinary. We went ahead and we did it. We turned it around rather quickly. We submitted it, again, another change in staff and supervisory roles. And so the 7 or 8 pages of comments that we had addressed appropriately or satisfactorily, at least in our opinion, was answered with another set of comments, 13 pages of comments. So, we were a little bit surprised by that. At this point, our client got very nervous because as things happen, there were some grants that were starting to become in peril. Fortunately, DTSC rallied, we all worked together, we got the work done, things were approved, went out and did the field work. We submitted a 3-page completion report, 3 pages, in November of 2023, which was ultimately approved earlier this year. So if you take a look at some of the timelines, of course, there's some extraneous circumstances, but there's a lot of time and a lot of brain damage that took place from everybody involved with the project. So by the numbers, again, about a 5-year project, we lost track of how many case officers or supervisors were changed out. These things happen. One pandemic, a 3-page report. It was a small project. It was a 3-page report for 4 days worth of field work on a project that took 5 years. We do want to point out though, this was a successful project. We and the lead consultant did win a National Project of the Year award. So again, a successful project by many metrics, but in some cases we have to look at it and ask ourselves, is there a better way? And I bring up that this is a cautionary takeaway because this was a fairly straightforward project. We were remediating what we used to call a ditch and putting in a fairly straightforward repair with well-characterized situations, a well-characterized RAW, no unexpected consequences or unexpected things were encountered in the field at any given time. It was a like land use, it was CEQA exempt. it should have been a slam dunk. It should have gone very straightforward. And again, this is not a criticism of people, but we all collectively can stand back and say, there's gotta be a better way. If projects like this take 5 years to get done and approved, what about the more difficult projects? What about the tougher ones where you're taking an industrial property going to residential, where there's gonna be some type of upzoning? So when you look at these and you look at the details behind the easy ones, we have to ask ourselves, how can we better solve the hard ones? Thank you.
All right, now it's your turn. Thank you so much to Serena, Rafat, and Gina and Jeff for their collaboration through this process and sharing these case studies. These are the topics. Serena, escaping limbo. How do you deal with delays? Does the rising tide raise all boats? How do we use community engagement as an asset to a project to accelerate redevelopment and make it beneficial? Better than 1 in a million. Gina said it all. Go see Gina at the middle table. Let's talk about vapor intrusion. Double jeopardy. Why do we keep re-reviewing projects? Why do we allow this for brownfields? Okay, so lovely speakers, will you head to your tables? Gina is going to be at this front one for a breakout. So if you want to talk about better than 1 in a million, go see Gina. Serena is going to be at the one in the back. If you want to talk about escaping limbo, go talk to her. Jeff is at the far back corner. If you want to go talk about double jeopardy and how we think about reforms for that. And Rafat, does the rising tide raise all boats, is up front. We're going to start with these breakout questions as soon as y'all get to the table of your choice. Great. Thank you. Right now on a Post-it, and please get in touch. So please feel free to finish up the conversation you're having. We have 5 minutes left. We'd love to see some more Post-its and ideas across the back, and use those little stickers to +1 them so we know what we should focus our time on as we continue to hopefully build this coalition for reform. Thank you guys so much.
No, let them talk.